Hello everyone. Some of you may have watched my previous video in which I examined and responded to an article featured in Wednesday's Guardian entitled "Yale Students Call for End of Focus on White Male Authors." The article detailed the grievances with a particular introductory module spanning a mere 2 semesters of the course, called English 125-126. Their grievance was caused by the module's content, specifically the affront at being forced to read the following selection of authors: Geoffrey Chaucer, Edmund Spenser, William Shakespeare, and John Donne in the fall, and John Milton, Alexander Pope, William Wordsworth, and T.S. Eliot, or another modern poet, in the spring. What crime did these authors commit to be reacted to in such a way? Why, being white and male, of course. In my previous video on the story, I neglected to cover the details of the petition, which, according to the Guardian's article, has 160 signatories so far. It seems that unless I sign the petition, I will have no way of knowing how much that number has grown since Wednesday. I like to hope not, but I digress. Today, when I'm more equipped to respond, certainly more awake, I would like to read out the petition and then give my response. So, the petition is entitled Petition to the Yale English Department Faculty. We, undergraduate students at Yale English Department, write to urge the faculty to re-evaluate the undergraduate curriculum. We ask the department to reconsider the current core requirements and the introductory courses for the major. In particular, we oppose the continued existence of the major English poets sequence as the primary prerequisite for further study. It is unacceptable that a Yale student considering studying English literature might read only white male authors. A year spent around a seminar table where the literary contributions of women, people of colour, and queer folk are absent actively harms all students, regardless of their identity. The major English poets sequences creates a culture that is especially hostile to women students of colour. When students are made to feel so alienated that they get up and leave the room, or get up and leave the major, something is wrong. The English department loses out when talented students engaged in literary and cultural analysis are driven away from the major. Students who continue on after taking the introductory sequence are ill-prepared to take higher-level courses relating to race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nationality, ability, or even to engage with critical theory or secondary scholarship. We ask that major English poets be abolished, and that the pre-1800-1900 requirements be refocused to deliberately include literatures relating to gender, race, sexuality, ableism, and ethnicity. It's time for the English major to decolonize, not diversify its course offerings. A 21st century education is a diverse education. We write to you today inspired by student activism across the university, and to make sure that you know that the English department is not immune from the collective call to action. It is our understanding that the faculty must vote in order to reconsider the major's requirements. Considering the concerns expressed here and elsewhere by undergraduate students, we believe that it would be unethical for any member of the faculty, no matter their stance on these issues, to vote against beginning the re-evaluation process. It is your responsibility as educators to listen to student voices. We have spoken. We are speaking. Pay attention. In essence, these self-proclaimed students of literature are trying to bully their faculty to remove one module of their course because its reading material was authored by white men. The bigotry of this campaign is pretty obvious for anyone with a brain, and something that I covered quite extensively in my previous video, so I will not cover that argument again. Aside from a very blatant racism and sexism against white men, there is a clear evidence that this whole campaign is based on assumptions outright delusions and ignorance on what it means to be a student of literature. They argue that the existence of this problematic course means that students might go through their entire 2, 3, or 4-year course without ever having read a word written by a non-white, female, queer, or trans author. We're talking about a course that only has 8 persons in its lineup of major poets, hardly enough to encapsulate a student's entire course. No doubt that there are a great many other modules to be taken in which non-white, female, etc. works are covered. I certainly did. It's as if these idiots are implying that, simply by being exposed to these 8 white male poets, their minds will be corrupted by their words, and thus they will refuse henceforth to read any literary work that is not written by a white man, out of sheer prejudice. Quite rich, coming from people who want to deny their fellow students the right to choose a module on the basis of the gender and race of the authors it covers. And of course, that like good double-thinkers, the students insist that such a bigoted module, simply by existing, harms everyone equally, even though by their own admission it especially harms their ilk and those of protected status, people of colour, etc. Their delusion requires that they believe everyone is affected, when in reality when the reality is that they only care about certain sorts of people, and that the only people who the course would ever affect are people insane enough to believe that a single module covering white male authors could be somehow harmful, i.e. them. The students who want to force the module to refocus on identity politics, effectively pushing out the major poets and trying to force in new faces regardless of ability and based entirely on who they are rather than the quality of their work. Not surprising as far as social justice warriors go, but just as disgusting and insidious. Regardless of whether or not these poets are right for an introduction to poetry, and they certainly are, that goes without saying. But what matters is the gender and skin colour of these poets, as far as these idiots are concerned. These freakish millennials do not care about substance, they care about image. This is appropriate, as this generation was raised to be hyper-aware of their own image and their own worth, and how others are all enemies with potential to harm these things in a host of ugly and violent ways. It is no wonder that Generation Snowflake exists, and is doing its best to force change where it is not needed, in order to protect their fragile mental and emotional fortitude. They will go to any means, even if it means denying the opportunities and rights of their peers, in this case their fellow students. These are not students of literature. If they were, they would have no problem delving into the words of any and all writers whose works they have the privilege to study, regardless of what they think of the individual who wrote them. In my second year of university, where I myself studied English literature, we were posed with a question. Should we still read the works of one Philip Larkin, an English poet, on the grounds of what many students and critics, mostly women, considered misogyny, to be found in several of his poems? Should we refuse to read any poet's work on the grounds of his unsavoury character and values? I know these Yale students with their facile, demanding petition certainly would. The correct answer is of course yes, we should. Regardless of what we may think of the poets themselves, their poetry, and indeed the work of any author of substance, is still worthy of analysis and criticism. We can still love the works of great authors and poets, whatever we may think of them as people, because they are part of history, not only of our culture but of history and our society. And the majority just happen to be white men. It is the truth, whether or not these students of literature want to hear it or not. To deny their fellow students the opportunity to study this module is a disgrace, and to betray and insult the memory of the works of great men of literature equally so. They who see a mere single module in an introduction to poetry as something harmful and alienating to so-called marginalized groups, and that it denies history, want to erase the voices of white men, poets, purely because they are white male poets, and deny their overwhelming part in our history in literature. It is insane, it is absurd, and if they are indulged, as they too often are, they will get their way. Generation Snowflake and all its dangerous, insane ways is covered extensively and accurately in Claire Fox's book, I Find That Offensive, as detailed in an article she wrote in The Spectator. I will leave the link in the description. The sheer entitlement, especially in the final paragraph, is staggering. The campaigners recognize their faculty's right to vote on their cause, but go on to threaten them by saying that a refusal to indulge their demands of a vote would be unethical. They, like children, are emboldened by indulgence, and they have been taught to be concerned only with their well-being, and know that others will be just as concerned with their well-being from childhood. Thus they are so arrogant as to demand the same from their tutors as adults. If the faculty refuse to acknowledge their demand to be heard, all hell will break loose in Yale once again. Expect tantrums, screaming, wailing, and similar. I think I will end this video with a quote from Carl Sagan. A book is made from a tree. It is an assemblage of flat, flexible parts, still called leaves, imprinted with dark, pigmented squiggles. One glance at it and you will hear the voice of another person, perhaps someone dead for thousands of years. Across the millennia, the author is speaking, clearly and silently, inside your head, directly to you. Writing is perhaps the greatest of human inventions, binding together people, citizens of distant epochs, who never knew one another. Books break the shackles of time, proof that humans can work magic. That is what it means to study literature. That is what it means to be a student of literature. We are scholars of a history of writing, of those past and present who provided us with incredible works of incredible power, beauty, and wonder, which help us understand and live our lives, and, equally important, to understand what makes good and bad literature, to analyze, to critique. To replace great masters of literature with frauds would be to tarnish that learning for everyone. To paraphrase the Italian and sadly white male writer and journalist Italo Calvino, we study and read books which, hundreds or even thousands of years later, have not finished saying what they have had to say. They are here for us to study, analyze, and critique, regardless of whether or not we like what they have to say. And yes, alas, most of them were white. Alas, most of them were male. The idiots campaigning to silence them would do well to understand that.